everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Male Perspective. I am your host, Lana Reid, and today, on this day, I have with me a gentleman by the name of Che Ramos, also known as the Black Bourbon Guy. He is a professional bourbon enthusiast, cocktail connoisseur, consultant in the industry, and I'm looking so forward to hearing more about his wonderful world of whiskey. But first and foremost, as I always do, I take a quick moment to pause, say thank you to you, sir, for making time for me today. Time is a gift. Once we give it, we can't get it back. So I appreciate you making space to sit down and chat with little old me. And with that, sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I want to take a little bit of time to appreciate you for the opportunity and for your time as well, because that certainly is a pendulum that swings both ways.
Awesome. Well, let me get started because I have a little bit of time with you and I'm trying to pack a lot of stuff in. But as I was getting ready for today's show, I was on your website and there was a sentence that I saw, I'm Black and I drink a lot of bourbon. And that was interesting to me because it made me think that the masses might not see those two going together often, being Black and drinking bourbon. So I did a little quick Google search and if I'm right, Black folks have been involved with bourbon for quite some time.
Quite some time. Just like just about every other industry, you can trace loosely Black contributions to the bourbon industry back to the formation of the bourbon industry, because it kind of tracks with the history of the United States. And as we know, for any large scale labor or any labor expertise that was being done in the 1700s, there's a good chance that there were Black fingerprints all over it, even if they remained invisible for generations.
Okay, good to know. Now, you are the guy who educates everybody on bourbon, and I want to let you know, you have the perfect student before you today, because I know absolutely positively nothing. The only thing that comes to mind when I think of bourbon is those big wooden barrels. And I remember when I was a child, I used to see those old cowboy flicks and the guy would tilt up a bottle of bourbon before he got a bullet pulled out of his arm or leg. So I need you to baby step me through the process, please, Mr. Ramos. What do you do to make a bourbon from start to bottle? How does that go?
So from beginning to end, whiskey making is just like the making of any other spirit out there. They're all cousins at the end of the day.
Okay.
It all comes down to fermentation, which is the process by which yeast cannibalizes sugar in the process of water and heat and creates ethanol, alcohol, and heat as a byproduct, right?
Okay.
Eventually, a long time ago, thousands of years ago, people figured out how to take that product, which is a type of beer or wine, and distill it, which is to say that they purify it. So ethanol burns or evaporates at a lower rate than water. So if you heat that temperature to a rate that's less than the temperature of boiling water, you can extract that pure ethanol, and those are the spirits that we like, right?
Okay.
Whenever you distill something once or twice or more than that, it comes off as a clear, colorless, odorless spirit. So in the whiskey industry, they call it white dog. 100 years ago in the backwoods of North Carolina, and still they call it moonshine, right? If you add a bunch of water to it and proof it down to about 80-90%, you can call it vodka.
Okay.
But what makes whiskey or bourbon specific is that bourbon has to be made from one of 4 grains. So by law, you can use corn, wheat, rye, or barley.
Okay.
For bourbon, it has to be in that mixture or mash bill. That's the recipe for the whiskey that they call it. Corn has to be the dominant grain. So it has to be 51% or better. And then after that comes in your memory of those wooden barrels, because it has to be aged in a brand new oak barrel. So that means that barrel cannot have been used to age any other substance. The inside of that barrel has to be charred. So they literally sit it on almost like large blow torches, and they shoot fire through it for 15 20, 30, 45 seconds, depending on how far they want that process to go. Then you age that clear product in there for about 2 years at minimum, or as long as you would like to take it. You have to bottle it at a minimum of 80 proof. And if you follow all of those steps, plus there's a couple of small ones in there that I didn't totally nerd out and get into. But if you hit all of those things, then you've created a straight bourbon whiskey. And that has to be done in the United States.
Has to be done in the United States.
Has to be done in the US. So you can make whiskey everywhere, right? You have Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, you have Japanese whiskey, you've got Indian whiskey. People make whiskey everywhere. It uses one of those 4 grains that we mentioned, but everybody's laws are a little bit different. So the laws governing Scotch whiskey are different than the laws governing Irish whiskey, and so on and so forth. But even internationally, bourbon is one of the most popular spirits on earth. Part of it is that in most of the world, people are making whiskey using barley because you ferment and distill whatever you have growing in your backyard.
Gotcha.
And prior to people arriving here from Northern Europe, corn didn't really grow like that, right?
Gotcha,
It wasn't until we moved into across the mountains that we began to make corn whiskey and eventually bourbon. Truth be told, the first American spirit was actually rye whiskey because that's what was growing in the Northeast in large quantities when people first started to arrive here.
Gotcha. Now, let me backtrack on one of the things you said about the process, because we're all in this issue of climate change and creating sustainable products. The barrels don't get reused. I mean, you use it once and that's it?
It is, yes, you are keying in on something. It is, so at the end of the day, when it started, it was a very wasteful process, right? Because by law, in order to make straight bourbon, you cannot use a barrel for the initial aging process, right? But after those 2 years, you can reuse a barrel. So let's say you wanted to, there are secondary aging processes, right? So you can age a straight bourbon for 2 years in a brand new oak barrel. You can take that liquid out and it's called bourbon at that point. And then you can put it into a Cabernet barrel. You can put it into a port barrel from Portugal that had previously been used to age a dessert wine, right? So you can reuse barrels in that way. But what has really started to come out is because of the popularity of the industry and our use of those barrels is that a bunch of other businesses have started to contract with whiskey distillers to use those barrels, right? So if you go to the supermarket, you've probably seen Cabernet that's been aged in bourbon barrels, or you'll see beer that's aged in bourbon barrels. A lot of Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey companies, they contract with bourbon companies to get cheap second used barrels. So if you go and you look into the information on a lot of your European whiskey makers, you'll see that they are now aging their product in bourbon barrels. And it didn't start that way, but because of the popularity of bourbon over the years and the price, right? Because those barrels are coming cheap to them. People are starting to age bourbon and everything. I mean, I've even seen they're making maple syrup that's aged in whiskey barrels at this point. So you name it, and people are throwing some sort of liquid into whiskey barrels to kind of capture that flavor because, I mean, everybody loves it, right?
So we have bourbon flavored maple syrup?
Yes, there is maple. So the first time I saw it was from a whiskey company out of Washington State called Woodinville. And they had taken their barrels, right? After they had drained the whiskey out, they had then taken maple syrup and filled the whole 53.5 gallon barrel with maple syrup. 53.5 gallons being the typical size for aging in the whiskey industry. And they let that maple syrup sit in there for, I'm not even sure how long on the top of my head, but it takes on a lot of the bourbon flavors and it takes on some of the color without taking in any of that alcohol, right? So you get some of that residual bourbon flavor. You get some of the vanilla and the baking spices that are present inside a traditionally charred oak barrel. And then after some time, they drain it out and they sell it. And you can really, really taste the difference. You can use it for pancake syrup. I personally like to use it to make cocktails with because it's a lot of fun.
Oh, interesting, interesting. So for a connoisseur such as yourself, how much, if we were to gift you a bottle of bourbon, how much would we be expecting to spend? Do we have to refinance the house and stuff? I mean, how much would something good for you cost?
So good for you is relative. One of the things that I love about whiskey is that it's really the people's spirit if you know what you're doing.
Okay.
You can find dynamite whiskey out there, and if you can find it at retail, it's not gonna cost you more than $50, right? And that'll get you a really good bottle, right? Like I'm not talking my everyday drinkers are $50. Like I'm a struggling entrepreneur. I don't have it like that.
Okay.
But even in the bourbon industry, the struggle is that it takes a long time to make whiskey, right? So by definition, you have to age it for 2 years. Your average whiskey is probably aged between 6 to 7 years in the bourbon world, right? Okay. So companies, let's say you're a brand new company, you start up, you get your money, you start working on your facility. It's going to be 6 to 7 years before you are able, if you're the one making your whiskey, to sell a single dollar worth of product, right? So it's very hard for new producers to get into the game. And then it can be difficult. Let's say you're a producer who's done really well. Let's say somebody decides this year that they really love your product and they buy it out of the stores. If that's a 6 to 7 year age bourbon, it's going to be another 6 to 7 years before you can increase production to keep up with things. So what starts happening is that as things get popular, people buy them up, and it literally becomes like the Jordan market is the best analogy I start to make for it. Especially in the Black community, for people who don't understand just how crazy bourbon can be. Like bourbon bottles, a lot of the high level ones are retailing at $45, $50, $60. Some of the super premium ones, maybe $130, but I haven't seen too many more that go higher than that. But on the secondary and tertiary market, you see them go as high as 2,000-3,000. I've seen very special bottles that have been auctioned off for as high as $10,000 to $15,000.
Well, we're gonna have to give away the first kid for that. That's a lot of for just a moment of
it's so one of the things that I love about whiskey, and something that's kind of changed my path a little bit as I've gone down this path in the business, is I'm still very much a huge enthusiast, but I'm starting to become more of a whiskey historian. Not in the sense that I'm running around sourcing, material myself, but I enjoy trying to read up on as many stories as I can, because part of what sells for these bottles is not just the liquid inside it, but it's the stories that go along with it.
Okay.
And when you look at something that really parallels American history the way that it does, right? Like Elijah Craig is one of the first on record producers of bourbon. And if you buy a bottle, it dates itself at 1789, right? There was a lot going on in 1789. So, for example, one of the bottles that I mentioned, It's a bottle of E.H. Taylor. So E.H. Taylor was named for an old whiskey colonel by the name of Edmund Haynes Taylor, who opened the first bourbon tourism destination in the country. I mean, the place had a castle, a moat. It's ridiculous. Prior to that, if you wanted to go visit a distillery, it was like, hey, here's where we make whiskey, here's where we age whiskey. Walk around, there's some dudes at work, don't get in their way, right? But this man built a castle. He wanted you to come out, he wanted you to walk around, he wanted you to have your wedding there. He was the beginning of all of that that is now exploded. He also made some pretty darn good bourbon at the same time.
Okay.
But eventually Prohibition hit and he died and his company went out of business. But a much larger company that a lot of people have heard of called Buffalo Trace, they were one of the few companies that was legally allowed to operate for medicinal purposes through Prohibition. There were 6 licenses that were granted. Buffalo Trace was one of the few that made it through. And during and after that time, they kind of looked around and found themselves in a market where so many companies had gone under and there were products and licensing and recipes and actual whiskey barrels that were just going to fall out of the history books. So they purchased a lot of them. And one of the big names that they purchased was that E.H. Taylor whiskey, right? For Colonel E.H. Taylor. So Buffalo Trace, fast forward, is a huge name in the whiskey game. And they have been producing E.H. Taylor's product, which is a very high level premium product, for years. At some point in the early or mid 2000s, a tornado ran through their property and took the roof right off of the top of Warehouse C, which was already a very famous warehouse because of the whiskey that it produced over the years. But Buffalo Trace, it had barrels that were aging there and it let those barrels sit until they were able to rebuild that roof. Now we're talking Frankfort, Kentucky here, right? So it's hot. They got rained on. Wow. You got cold nights. And this thing had no roof for I don't know how long, right? However, you know that the whiskey inside those barrels is now historic.
Yeah.
So when they decided to bottle those things, you now had a bottle of E.H. Taylor, which is famous in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
It comes from Warehouse C, which is a famous warehouse. Yeah. But now some of them are stamped tornado surviving. And those were the ones that I mentioned. If you can get your hands on one, they have literally gone for 10 to 15,000, because even if it's not better, do you have a bottle of bourbon that survived the tornado?
Yeah. You don't even understand the history behind it. So I get it. But I'm just thinking $10,000 for a quick sip. But now the whole history and the story behind it. Okay, I understand now. It makes more sense. It is truly a classic and hard to come by. So understand. So you're talking about all of these companies and this one purchased this one or whatever. And then listening to it takes 6 years just to get a bottle of bourbon and everything. Us as entrepreneurs, Black folks as entrepreneurs, we don't have the time sometimes. We don't have the financial resources to do this. Are there any or many Black-owned bourbon labels?
So there are a handful, and what I love is that we exist in a time right now where there are a lot more that are growing every day, right? Okay. In 2015, one of the biggest companies, Brown-Forman, they uncovered some research by which they understood that one of the people, or not one of the people, the person who taught Jack Daniels how to make Tennessee whiskey was a former enslaved person by the name of Nathaniel Nearest Green, right? Okay. A lot of that research was done in conjunction with an entrepreneur named Fawn Weaver, who fast forward 2 years, generated a ton of capital and started a Tennessee whiskey company that is Black owned, called Uncle Nearest, to honor that first master distiller. So in one very short period of time, you have a huge liquor conglomerate that is honoring a Black man as its first master distiller, which is a huge step. Hats off to them. Of course, maybe too little, too late, but you got to take the victories when you get
When you
them.
can.
So kudos to Brown-Forman and the company that both did the research and acknowledged. Kudos to Fawn Weaver and Uncle Nearest. Now Uncle Nearest is one of the fastest growing whiskey companies, period, right? Black owned, white owned, woman owned, man owned, doesn't matter, in America. So they are out here crushing it, and their success in conjunction with the story has led to a just resurgence of people like myself getting into the whiskey industry in so many different ways. So to answer your question, there's a handful of great Black brands out there. Off the top of my head, to name a few, there's the Bro Brothers, Brough. They are in Kentucky. They've been around for a couple of years now, make a fantastic product. There's a whiskey called St. Cloud based out of California. They make a dope product. There's another one based out of my current home in Durham, North Carolina, called Old Hillside Bourbon, which is the work of 4 brothers who went to the Old Hillside High School in Durham, who got together to produce a product. There's another great one, I believe they're in Montana. It's called St. Liberty Whiskey, and it's partially Black owned by 2 women who used to work for the spirits arm of Bad Boy, I believe it was. And they helped rebrand the product so that it now honors Black female bootleggers during the Prohibition era. So if you get a bottle,
we had some bootleggers, huh?
Yeah.
We got Viola Davis doing the women, and now we had some bootleggers.
Don't ever let anybody tell you we weren't everywhere, because we were everywhere. So yeah, you get a bottle of St. Liberty and it has the image of that woman, and they tell her story on the back of the bottle.
Awesome. Okay, I'm learning me a thing or two. Okay. Well, let me circle back, sir, because I am running out of time. I want to go back to this bourbon thing because I'm trying to absorb as much as I can. On your Instagram, you have a post, and you were talking about a collaboration, and correct me if I'm wrong, with Peerless Distilling Company. But what I want to talk about is the tasting notes. And you said nose, cinnamon toast crunch, roasted peanuts, white pepper, orange peel, and palate, banana nut bread, toffee, sweet chili, spicy cinnamon, think Big Red. Now, to me, that sounds like breakfast, dinner, and dessert, but it makes me wonder, for a whiskey bourbon drinker, what qualifies as a bad bourbon, and what taste are you looking for as far as a good bottle?
So there are certainly subjective versus objective qualifiers for what makes some whiskey better than others, right? Subjectively speaking, it all has to start with the quality of the product that goes into it, right? With every fermented or distilled beverage, you can't fake how it begins. So you have to use high quality corn, wheat, etc., right? Whatever went into that to begin with. Your water has to be good. And that's part of why Kentucky is so popular for its whiskey production. 95% of the bourbon made in America, although you can make it everywhere, 95% of it is coming out of Kentucky. So something about that corn from Kentucky and the water from Kentucky and the weather in Kentucky
and all of that stuff.
It produces a product that people seem to love, right? So if you're not taking care of the land, and then you grow corn on that land, and then you make whiskey out of it, that whiskey is invariably going to be not very good, right? That's the headache stuff that you don't want to necessarily buy. So you stay away from that. Now, what makes a whiskey that you're going to enjoy, that entirely depends on you. And that's where those tasting notes come in. So much of what I do is helping people to understand what drives flavor profiles in whiskey, because it comes from very specific places, right? The mash bill, the makeup, the recipe that we talked about earlier, that makes up a huge part of the end flavor of any bourbon.
Okay.
How long you age it for takes a huge part of that flavor. What kind of yeast they use makes up a huge part of that flavor as well. But then those tasting notes, they're going to kind of lead you in a direction that will help you say, like, yeah, this sounds like something that I like, right? So if Cinnamon Toast Crunch is something that you enjoy in a whiskey, then hey, this is going to be something that you enjoy, right? But
Okay.
I also put in that note about the spicy cinnamon, because I mean, we're not talking about like soft,
It's got a
cakey,
kick.
you know, it's gonna light you up a little bit.
Okay.
And you know, Big Red is a great comparison
remember,
for
yeah.
that, right? Like I love to use descriptors that we can relate to, because I spent a lot of time in the wine world, and people, some wine people, not all people, and a lot of people in the whiskey world can also be really, really pretentious, right? It doesn't matter if you're using a hyper accurate word to describe something or a flavor if nobody knows what that word is, right? So if I'm in a room with 100 people and I describe a whiskey as phenolic, half of that, I mean, more than half of that room is going to be looking at me like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
You know? But if you say Big Red, or you know, banana nut
Then,
bread,
like,
or
I got you. I know that.
exactly.
So who's sitting? How does this work? I guess, you know, okay, we're about to create some bourbon, and I think I need to go get some cinnamon toast and some big. How does that part happen?
So none of those things are actually in
Yeah.
the whiskey, right? You can't legally add anything other than water and those grain things that we mentioned before. But it's just like if you've ever been to a wine tasting, everything in that process can produce flavors that are similar to
Oh,
things that we just associate with other flavors, right?
gotcha.
Like I mean, I've had whiskey that tasted like cotton candy or
Oh,
pecans, or God, it runs the gamut. But just so many flavors out there, and that's part of the fun for me, right?
okay.
To taste different things and say, okay, this reminds me of this reminds me of that. And as I go down that process, it helps me refine my taste and
Okay.
figure out what it is, right? So that now if I'm in a restaurant or if I'm in a liquor store, I can look and I can read and interpret a bottle of bourbon just like I could a bottle of wine. And I can say, okay, there's a high likelihood that based on what I like and what this says, I'm going to enjoy this. Now, that's not 100% hit rate, right? But you know, the more you know about yourself really and what you like, and it's all about repetition, it
Okay.
will help inform you as to what a good bottle is for you, right? And don't let anybody else tell you what to drink, because what you drink is what you drink, and what you like is what you like, and that's different for everybody.
Okay. Well, you have an event, educational experience that you help people figure out what they like and what they don't like. Uh, Let me see if I remember correctly. Virtual blind bourbon experience. Did I get that right?
That's perfect. That's perfect. So yeah, one of the things that I do is our virtual blind bourbon experience. So blind tasting is the best way to figure out what you like, right?
Okay.
In really all of the sales world, advertising is everything, and whiskey advertisers are really good at what they do, right?
Okay.
So a lot of the most popular things out there, and this is true for all alcohol brands, it's about selling it based on some connection to you, right? So why do people love Casamigos? Because they love George Clooney, right?
Okay. Mhm.
I, I don't know that they're making a statement as to whether it's good or not, but you feel like you're hanging out with George Clooney or going on a date with George Clooney, right? George Clooney is that dude that men want to be him, and
Yeah.
you know, heterosexual women want to be with him. So
Yeah.
so George Clooney sells Casamigos, right? And the same is true for the whiskey world. So if
Okay.
you remove those things though, and you taste things side by side, you can get a much more honest idea of like, hey, do I like this? And why do I like this? Right.
Okay.
So blind tasting is really the only way to do that. So we send out some dope samples of whiskey to folks, a little bit of educational material, and then we spend about an hour and a half in a once a month setting, blind tasting through things. And at the end, we reveal the various labels that we tasted, as much
Oh,
information as we can find on them. And usually between the three, most times people find a new and surprising favorite style or label that they wouldn't have known before.
okay. Awesome. Awesome. Let me ask you this. If you were tasked with converting a group of us to the wonders of bourbon, and let's see here, you find most of us at the cookout, you know, ribs on the grill, chicken and the hot dogs for the kids, spades and dominoes playing. Most of the time you see beer and Hennessy. Hennessy is not bourbon, is it? No, it's not.
No, Hennessy is cognac, and it's one of the most famous spirits on earth.
Oh, okay. So if you were tasked at this group setting where there's a whole bunch of us to convert us all to bourbon, what would you bring to the cookout? What would be your go-to brand for conversion?
So I don't know that I have a go-to brand, but I'd start with something on the sweeter side.
Okay.
So for most of us, right, when we all start drinking, we all start sweet. Like I don't care who tells you otherwise, right? Anybody who tells you that they just started off drinking moonshine, like that person is lying. Somewhere there is a photo of them chugging Boone's Farm, you know, behind a trailer somewhere. And why? Because ethanol is literally a poison, right?
Yeah.
So if you have ethanol for the first time, your body is screaming like, hey, stay
Help.
away from that thing, right? So typically how we counteract that is by adding sugar. So
Got you.
most drinkers, it doesn't matter what you drink, right? People start off with lighter, sweeter beers, sweeter
Okay.
wines, sweeter cocktails.
Okay.
So if you want to start off in the bourbon world specifically, there are some that are sweeter than others. One of the styles that I recommend is called a wheated bourbon.
Okay.
So by law, bourbon has to be 51% corn in the mash bill, but the secondary ingredient in most bourbon is going to be rye and then malted barley. At some point in the late 1800s, somebody decided to pull that rye out because it was the spicier of the three grains that they were using, and they replaced it with wheat, which was a little bit softer and sweeter and earthier.
Okay.
And the end product of that was a whiskey that was sweeter,
Okay.
softer, and a little bit earthier. So to kind of introduce somebody, you don't want to start big and bombastic and punchy and, you know, all that good stuff. You want to start with something that's definitively bourbon, but is a nice, soft, fairly sweet introduction to the game. And there's a lot of them out there. Maker's Mark is a good brand. Larceny is another good brand. If you want to start with something that's not going to break the bank, because I don't think either one of those is over $30 in most markets.
No, we're not bringing that to the cookout. Nothing over $30. I got you. I got
No.
you.
Handles only to the cookout.
So let me ask this: as we are all coming out of this COVID fog, and we're all starting to move about in this world, people have the opportunity to actually see and meet you in person. If they're in the Durham, North Carolina area, you're actually a very skilled bartender, and they can have you mix them a drink or two, right?
It's true. So I don't work at any brick and mortar location right now. I do a little bit of event bartending from time to time. I actually had a great event this weekend. there's a great bar in downtown Durham called Alley 26. They were recently nominated for a James Beard Award and came in as a runner-up, but they do a Whiskey Wednesday event every Wednesday where they pick a pour and offer it basically at a break-even price, which is a great option for people to come out and try something at a relatively low investment. And once a month, the last Wednesday of every month, I have a residency there. So I get to pick the bottle in conjunction with them and present it. And so if people are in the area, it's a great opportunity to come out and meet me, drink some dope whiskey, and just have a great time at a really fantastic environment.
Last Wednesday of the month.
Last Wednesday of the month at Alley 26.
Awesome. Now, let me ask you this. Is it more important for a bartender to have a counseling therapist ear or skilled mixing skills?
Ooh, so the interesting thing about a good bartender is both of those, right? Like a good bartender is part maitre d', part therapist, part show person, right? Because I for years I was a bar manager, general manager, and I used to tell people that you are on stage, right? When you have all of these bottles of booze behind you, for better or for worse, you draw people's attention. Every time you shake a cocktail, you draw people's attention, right? So you can sit there and you can shake, or you can shake and make a show out of it, right?
Okay.
And better bars, people appreciate that, but it all depends on the type of bar that you're going to, right? And you as a consumer need to be aware of that. A lot of people don't get that, right?
Wow.
So there are places where you have higher end cocktails and it's going to take 10 to 15 minutes for you to get your drink, right? And that cocktail is going to take you $20, cost you $20, $15, whatever, but it's probably going to be really dope. And if you're not into high end cocktails or you don't want to pay that sort of money that night, then you need to go to a different place where the prices are not going to be as high, right? The wait time's not going to be as low. But if you go to either one of those places expecting the other, you will find yourself very disappointed. So there are times where I want a high-end cocktail. Like I want to go and I want to see what you're doing that's really innovative and cutting edge or seasonal and so on and so forth. And, I just got paid and I got a little bit of money to burn.
Okay.
And then there are times where I want to go to a dive bar and what I want is shots and beer. And I don't want to pay,
No more than
$10 a
$5.
beer tonight. Right.
Got you. Now, I heard you say that you were a bar manager, and then it made me think about our earlier conversation about these new brands, Black-owned brands. How hard is it for a up-and-coming brand to actually connect with somebody like you and get their product into the bar? Is that a hard process?
It can be. So part of it depends on the state in which you find yourself. The state of North Carolina and a handful of other states is a North Carolina control state. I'm sorry, an alcohol control state, which is to say that all of the spirituous alcohol, so all your liquor that comes in the state and a lot of your other distilled product, it all has to be purchased by the state board and is all sold at state stores. So in North Carolina, it can be difficult as a smaller producer to get in, right? Because you're not producing and going to a bar. You're producing and then you have to sell it to the state of North Carolina. So even if you there's a distillery in downtown Durham, not black owned, but they make gin. And when they first opened up, the owner of the distillery was telling me, he's like, so wait a minute, I have to make my distillery here in Durham. But at the time I couldn't sell it to anyone in Durham. I had to sell it to the state board in Raleigh, right? First convince them to carry it, get it permitted and all that good stuff, sell it to them, and then they would sell it back to ABC stores all over the state. So in places that are ABC controlled, that can be a very steep uphill climb for a young entrepreneur because you are talking to people who have tremendous buying power. And there's a lot of who are you? So if you don't have the right relationships or deep enough pockets, good luck to you.
Gotcha. So my assumption is in states like that, they don't have a wide variety selection as other states might have, because it's just too hard for some of the manufacturers to get in there, right?
Yeah, not quite as wide. North Carolina is not as bad as some other states. We do pretty well here comparatively, but yes, it certainly does restrict you to some extent. Now, the flip side to that is in most of those states, as far as I'm aware, all of the prices at ABC stores are maintained at retail, which
Gotcha.
is the good side, right? Because if you find yourself in a state that's not liquor controlled, right? Say you go up to New York and you
California.
try, yeah, I mean, you can find it all. Like I went to the Bourbon Trail this summer in Kentucky, and you can find all kinds of stuff, right? If you got cash in hand or you're ready to take out a loan, or like you said, put your first child up, like
Yeah.
I can't come home to my wife like, baby, I found my top 10
I
wish
got
list
my
of bourbon,
bourbon. Had to let the kid go.
right? Right. I had to trade in the car for just 3 or 4 bottles. So there's a toss up.
Yeah.
It can make it harder to find, but if you can find it and it costs you 10 times what it's worth, it's lost its value. And to go back to what we talked about a little while ago, I think one of the things I enjoy about bourbon is that it's the spirit of the people. Some of my favorite whiskeys are $35, right? So if I find it and it costs $235, like that's a hard pass for me.
Yeah, yeah, and the environment that it creates. Well, sir, I have enjoyed learning about bourbon and whiskey and just everything. I just Pshoosh, open my mind here. I'm going to ask you my random question, and then if I could trouble you to let us know how we connect with you, possibly sign up for the virtual classes, and just everything that we can do to get in touch with you. Okay. So let me ask you this first. Yeah. Let's see what we got first.
All right, this should be fun.
Let's see what we've got. I'm going to get me a like an official roller thing somewhere, but. Okay, should you put your socks on first or your pants?
Ooh, I'm a pants on first person. Yeah. Because my pants often dictate what kind of socks I'm gonna wear. And sometimes you just don't know. It's a game time decision, right?
Yeah.
Right. So yeah. No judgment to anybody who does it otherwise, because I'm also in a warm weather state. And so, like, when I was waking up, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, right? If I woke up in Brooklyn,
shoveling snow.
You don't want to plant your feet down on whatever hard floor is in your room if you're not ready to go. So, different strokes for different folks.
Gotcha. Oh, too cute. Well, sir, Mr. Ramos, please tell us how we connect with you, learn more about signing up for one of the events and, everything. Just let us know how we connect with you.
Yeah, awesome. Well, my website is blackbourbonguy.com. Super easy to remember. Instagram account is the Black Bourbon Guy, and my email is CHE at blackbourbonguy.com. You can sign up for my virtual blind bourbon experience on the website using my events tab. I've also got a fun store, sell some t-shirts. I've got a bourbon is for everybody movement, because bourbon is for everybody. And unfortunately, far too many people need to be reminded of that. So grab a t-shirt, join the movement. And I'd love to hear from anybody who has any questions.
Awesome. I love it. Well, I just appreciate you spreading the wonders and creating a diverse environment about bourbon. I think, like the wine environment, it kind of, people lend it to the more bougie crowd. So I think I appreciate the work that you're doing. Hopefully we won't see you one day kicked out because you've sold the kids for a good bottle of bourbon.
Nah, can't do that. I do this for them. So awesome. Definitely not.
Awesome. We'll keep on spreading the history of it. And much success to you. I just truly appreciate you and enjoy everything that you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you again so much for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. That is all for this week's episode of The Male Perspective. I'm your host, Lana Reid, and I will see everybody next time.